one of the things that has to come into mind if we have 3, 4, let's see, right now we have 4 drugs approved in the United States in second line, regorafenib, cabozantinib, nivolumab, and pembrolizumab. And probably, presumably, ramucirumab will be approved at some date. How do we think about this? Do we think about this as, okay, frontline TKI, second line TKI, we'll just batch TKI versus IO, right? Or do we go TKI, TKI, then IO? What do you think?
So,
how do you think?
it's difficult, right? So let's say patient progresses on first-line therapy, and I have the option today of giving them regorafenib, cabozantinib, nivolumab, or pembrolizumab. Let's batch the TKIs together for a minute and the PD-1 agents together for a minute. I think the TKI sequence, again, is a very valid sequence based on phase 3 evidence, level 1 evidence, and it's actually a great option for patients who've tolerated TKI therapy. Patients who didn't tolerate TKIs very well in first line, I tend to prefer switching them to in a different agent with a different safety profile, i.e. an anti-PD-1 agent.
So when you know, I'm going to pin you down on that,
okay,
right? Because like from the resource analysis that you alluded to where we looked at the survival of the sequence, we also looked at toxicity, right? And you know, patients who needed a dose reduction with sorafenib, they derived the same benefit with regorafenib. There was similar toxicities for that group of patients, maybe a little higher with full dose rego. But the time on sorafenib didn't necessarily predict time on regorafenib. The magnitude of the benefit was the same. So when you say didn't tolerate frontline TKI, whether it's lenvatinib or sorafenib, what does that mean, didn't tolerate it well?
So the easy part of the answer is the patients who would not have qualified for the resource trial with regorafenib, meaning patients who couldn't even tolerate 400 milligrams daily of sorafenib. And those patients do exist.
Yes.
So those patients, I would prefer to put them, easy decision to put them on an anti-PD-1 agent. For the patients who would have met the strict criteria for the resource trial, but had repeated grade 2 toxicities, repeated interruptions, I agree with you that the data, the evidence tells us that they could derive the same benefit. But from a patient perspective and a practitioner perspective, it's harder, right? The patient is suffering more, the physician's having to do more interventions. And it may be that in practice, those patients tend to be switched to an anti-PD-1 more frequently. But again, this is just practice, not science.
Of course, yeah.
The last group of patients where we may preferentially want to switch to an anti-PD-1 agent in second line are the patients that are progressing, quote unquote, quickly, where they may not make it to a third line option. And many physicians feel like we don't want to we don't want these patients to lose the opportunity to be on an anti-PD-1 agents in case they are one of those responders, because we know that the responders tend to do very well, have prolonged duration of response, and that seems to also be associated with really prolonged survival. So if the patient's not going to make it to third line, we want to give them the chance of exposure to an anti-PD-1 agent, and that's a clinical judgment.
Yeah. And I think that exposure, I mean, how many patients out of 100 are those that get PD-1 that have that great response? What would you estimate that?
Well, again, roughly would estimate somewhere between 15 and 20%. But if we look at Checkmate 040, which has longer follow-up now than the pembrolizumab data, when we look at patients who achieve their response, their median survival has not been even reached.
They do very well.
They do very well.
And I think all of us who have used these drugs, whether Pembro or Nivo, if you respond, you do well.
Yes.
What about stable disease with them, right? So let me bring up a few points, right? You know, we have the sequence of sorafenib to rego, sorafenib to cabo. I'm going to ask you a few questions. So you talked about the patient who didn't tolerate sorafenib so well, and maybe you wouldn't go to rego. Would that influence your choice for cabozantinib? Is it the same logic?
Probably. Again, because the side effect profile tends to be largely overlapping as another TKI.
Yeah, and you know, we've talked about, and you alluded to the fact that maybe the resource study was a very selected group of patients, right? And what I always find interesting is even though they required this minimum period of sorafenib, they had documented disease progression, so the control group for resource behaved just as the same as the control group in all the other phase 3 studies, right? So I think we can, say it was selected on some characteristics, but the population in reality behaved very similar.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so now you say for the patient who might not make it a third line, you go PD-1 up front because of that 15%. You hope you're going to be a good responder. So say you start PD-1 and they have stable disease, right? How do you monitor them? And what decision do you make to go then to your third line TKI?
Right. So like every other cancer therapy we use, as I tell patients, stable disease is considered success in cancer, okay? Now that's a large group with anti-PD-1 agents. Hopefully with the phase 3 data we'll understand more what the impact of stable disease is. But nonetheless, as long as they have stable disease, we monitor them with regular imaging. I tend to not rely heavily on AFP rather than on imaging. And as is accepted with IO agents and other diseases, we tend, unless the patient is clinically progressing, we tend not to switch out of the anti-PD-1 agent at the first progression. Meaning if there is a minor radiologic progression, patient's doing well clinically, generally I would continue and confirm this progression on a subsequent scan 6 to 8 weeks later.
So is that something unique to IO, or is that something in the context you do that with the TKIs as well?
I mean, we've done this with sorafenib, as you alluded to earlier. We waited for clinical, not just radiologic progression. But again, because of the availability of multiple agents now, we tend to be a bit more strict at calling progression. But with the IO agents, there is always this concept that, especially early in the disease, you may see something that looks like a progression, but the patient subsequently have stabilization or even a response. And in a nutshell, when we looked at that in the Checkmate 040 study, that was about 19 to 20% of patients who subsequently had stabilization or response again. And they tended to do well.